In the summer of 2400 before Christ, an entire Egyptian village simply vanished from history. Not destroyed by war, not buried by sandstorms, not abandoned gradually over decades. 3,000 souls, farmers, craftsmen, children, elders, all gone within 4 months. The mud brick houses still stood. The pottery remained unbroken on shelves. Food sat rotting in cooking pots. But every single human being had disappeared, leaving behind only scattered bones and a silence so complete that even the birds refused to nest there. What could erase an entire community so quickly that people fled without taking their most precious possessions? What terror was so absolute that mothers abandoned their children's toys and fathers left behind tools that had fed their families for generations? The answer lies buried in the ancient irrigation channels of the Nile Delta, in papyrus records that speak of a summer when the sacred river forgot to flood, and in the desperate choices made by people facing the unthinkable. Before we continue with the story of Kemwaset village and its tragic fate, tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from ancient Egypt. Now, let me take you back 45 centuries to witness how quickly civilization can crumble when nature turns its back on humanity. Kemwaset village lay like a green jewel in the northern delta, where the Nile split into countless waterways before flowing into the Great Green Sea. For 8 generations, its people had lived according to the rhythm of the sacred river, planting during the season of emergence, harvesting during the season of drought, and celebrating during the season of inundation, when Hapi, god of the flood, blessed their fields with life-giving silt. The village housed nearly 3,000 souls spread across family compounds built from Nile mud and palm fronds. Akhet-Ah, the village headman, lived in the largest house near the temple of Sobek, the crocodile god who controlled the waters. His compound included granaries that could store grain for 2 full seasons, workshops where his servants crafted pottery for trade with Memphis, and a small shrine where his family made daily offerings of bread and beer. Most villagers were farmers who worked plots of land measured in araras, each family typically owning between 3 and 7 araras, depending on their wealth and the number of sons they could contribute to communal projects. During planting season, the entire community worked together to maintain the complex network of irrigation canals that channeled the Nile's waters to every field. Children as young as 6 learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when dikes needed repair or when silt deposits required clearing. The village craftsmen included Seneb the potter, whose family had perfected techniques for creating storage jars that kept grain dry for years. There was also Katie the weaver, whose wife Neferet trained young girls to spin flax into linen fine enough to trade with wealthy families in Memphis. The village supported 2 brewers, essential workers since beer was safer to drink than water and formed part of every worker's daily ration. Kemwaset's spiritual life centered around the limestone temple, where Kemwaset, the hereditary priest of Sobek, conducted daily rituals to ensure the river's continued favor. Every morning before dawn, he would wade into the Nile carrying offerings of fresh bread, honey, and lotus flowers. The temple also housed the village's most precious possession, a sacred crocodile named Pitis, believed to be an incarnation of Sobek himself. Feeding and caring for Pitis was considered the highest honor in the village. The social order seemed as permanent as the river itself. Wealthy farmers like Akhet-Ah made decisions for the community and organized the labor gangs that maintained the irrigation system. Below them were the independent farmers who owned their own plots, then the tenant farmers who worked land belonging to others, and finally the laborers who owned nothing but their strength. Yet even the poorest families could expect to eat barley bread daily and drink beer during the evening meal. Women held important roles despite not owning land. They managed household finances, supervised food storage, and controlled the intricate process of bread making that fed the entire community. Elderly women like Itet, Akhet-Ah's mother, commanded great respect as keepers of agricultural wisdom. They could predict weather patterns, diagnose plant diseases, and organize the communal work that processed the harvest. Children grew up understanding their place in this ancient cycle. Boys learned farming techniques from their fathers and uncles, while girls mastered the domestic skills that kept families fed and clothed. During flood season, when farm work was impossible, the village became a center of activity as people crafted goods for trade, repaired tools, and celebrated festivals, honoring the gods who made their prosperity possible. Trade connected Khemwaset to the wider world. Merchant boats regularly stopped to exchange manufactured goods from Memphis for surplus grain, dried fish, and linen. These traders brought news from other regions, exotic foods like dates from Nubia, and luxury items like copper jewelry that wealthy villagers could afford. Life was not easy, but it was predictable. Families passed down both land and knowledge through generations. Young people married within the community, ensuring that agricultural techniques and social relationships remained stable. The rhythm of flood, planting, and harvest had sustained this way of life for centuries. As the season of inundation approached in the 23rd year of Pharaoh Neferefre's reign, no one in Khemwaset could have imagined they were living through their final months of prosperity. The first sign of disaster came not from the sky or from enemy armies, but from the sacred river itself. Katie the farmer noticed it on the morning of the festival of Sopdet, when the star goddess traditionally announced the coming flood. Instead of the usual muddy brown surge that marked the beginning of inundation, the Nile flowed clear and low between its banks. "Perhaps Hapi is testing our faith," suggested Khemwaset the priest, as villagers gathered anxiously around the temple. "We must increase our offerings and purify ourselves more thoroughly." But privately, the old priest felt a cold dread settling in his chest. In 50 years of serving Sobek, he had never seen the river behave so strangely. Days passed with no sign of the flood that should have begun transforming the delta into a vast lake. The irrigation canals, normally filled to overflowing by this time, contained only stagnant pools that bred swarms of biting insects. Fish that usually thrived during inundation began dying in the shallow water, their silver bodies floating belly up in the morning sun. Akheta called a meeting of the village elders in the shade of the largest sycamore tree. "The boats from Memphis report the same problem throughout the delta," he announced, trying to keep worry from his voice. "The flood is late this year, but it will come. Hapi has never abandoned the faithful." Yet even as he spoke these reassuring words, Akheta was calculating how long the grain stored in his granaries would last if the planting season had to be delayed. Weeks turned into months with no flood. The irrigation ditches cracked open under the relentless sun, revealing pottery shards and animal bones from decades past. Palm trees that had stood green and tall began dropping their fronds. The sacred pool where Petis the crocodile lived shrank daily until the great beast could barely submerge his scaly back. By the time the season of emergence should have begun, desperation had replaced hope. Families started rationing their stored grain, measuring out smaller portions of barley for the daily bread. Children who had never known hunger began asking why their stomachs ached constantly. The village brewers stopped making beer except for religious ceremonies, since the barley was too precious to use for anything but food. "We must send messengers to Memphis," declared Nebet, wife of the village headman. "Surely Pharaoh's granaries can spare grain for loyal subjects." But when the messengers returned 2 weeks later, their faces told the story before they spoke. The entire delta was suffering. Pharaoh's own administrators were imposing strict rationing in the capital. No help would come from Memphis. The social bonds that had held the community together for generations began fraying like old rope under tension. Wealthy farmers like Akheta found themselves besieged by desperate neighbors begging to buy grain at any price. Some families sold their copper jewelry, their finest linen, even their farming tools to purchase a few measures of barley. Others packed their possessions and headed south toward Thebes, hoping conditions might be better in Upper Egypt. As autumn approached with still no flood, the situation became critical. The village's remaining grain stores were guarded day and night after several desperate attempts at theft. Children too weak to work lay listlessly in the shade while their parents argued over how to divide the meager daily rations. The old and sick began dying first, not from any disease but simply from bodies too weakened by hunger to continue functioning. Khemwaset the priest grew gaunt, performing increasingly elaborate rituals to appease the gods. He sacrificed the temple's last goose to Sobek, offered precious incense to Hapi, and led the community in chanting prayers from dawn to dusk. But even sacred Petis was suffering, his mighty frame shrinking as the temple pool turned to mud. The breaking point came on a scorching afternoon when Seneb the potter collapsed while trying to dig a deeper well. As villagers carried his unconscious body to the shade, they noticed something that filled them with new terror. His skin bore the telltale marks that would soon become all too familiar, dark swellings in his neck and armpits, accompanied by a fever that no amount of cool water could reduce. That evening, as Seneb thrashed in delirium, his wife Tawi made a discovery that would haunt her final days. The family's grain storage jar, carefully sealed and protected, showed clear signs of contamination. Tiny droppings scattered among the barley revealed the presence of rats that had grown desperate enough to chew through pottery that had kept grain safe for generations. By dawn, 3 more villagers were showing similar symptoms. The plague had arrived in Kayamwaset, carried by vermin as desperate for food as the people they would ultimately destroy. The rats came at night, driven by the same starvation that plagued the human inhabitants of Kayamwaset. For months these creatures had survived by scavenging scraps from the nearly empty granaries, but as food became scarcer, they grew bold and vicious. Families would wake to find their carefully hoarded grain contaminated by droppings, their precious stores of dried fish gnawed into inedible fragments. What the villagers could not know was that these rats carried death in their blood. The same trade routes that had once brought prosperity to the delta now served as highways for disease. Infected fleas had traveled on grain ships from as far away as the ports of Lebanon, where similar droughts had created ideal conditions for plague to spread among weakened populations. The first victims died within days of Seneb's collapse. The potter himself succumbed on the 3rd night, his body racked with fever and pain. His wife Tawi followed 2 days later, along with their youngest son. The family's pottery workshop, once filled with the cheerful sound of spinning wheels and friendly conversation, fell silent, except for the scurrying of rats searching for any remaining food scraps. Kaimheset the priest tried desperately to maintain order through religious ritual. He declared that the plague was a test from the gods, a purification that would cleanse the village of any sins that might have caused the failed flood. Families were instructed to confess their transgressions at the temple and make whatever offerings they could afford. The priest himself fasted for 7 days, drinking only water while praying for divine intervention. But the gods remained silent as the death toll mounted. Within 2 weeks of the first case, nearly 50 villagers had died. The traditional burial practices that had been followed for centuries became impossible to maintain. Families lacked the strength to mummify their dead properly, and the community had no resources for elaborate funeral goods. Bodies were wrapped in whatever linen could be spared and buried quickly in shallow graves outside the village. Akhet Ah, the village headman, watched his authority crumble along with the community he had led for 15 years. His own granaries, once the envy of neighboring settlements, were now nearly empty. The wealth that had sustained his large household for generations disappeared as servants died or fled, taking with them whatever possessions they could carry. His youngest daughter, barely 7 years old, became ill on the same day that his elderly mother stopped eating entirely, preferring to starve rather than consume food that might keep a younger person alive. The social order that had seemed as permanent as the river itself dissolved in the face of absolute desperation. Tenant farmers abandoned their obligations to landowners, taking whatever grain they could find and fleeing toward Memphis. Craftsmen ceased practicing their trades as their customers died or departed. The village brewery closed when its owner fell sick, and the last stores of barley were deemed too precious to convert into beer. Neighbors who had shared meals and celebrated festivals together began viewing each other with suspicion and fear. Families barricaded themselves in their compounds, refusing to allow anyone inside who might be carrying the disease. Children who had played together since birth were forbidden from meeting, as parents tried desperately to protect their offspring from infection. The plague showed no mercy for age or status. Kaimheset the priest developed the familiar swellings in his neck after conducting funeral rites for a prominent farmer. He continued performing ceremonies even as fever clouded his mind, believing that his death in service to the gods might somehow convince them to spare the remaining villagers. He collapsed while feeding sacred pitis and died 2 days later in the temple where he had served faithfully for 5 decades. With the priest gone, the community lost its spiritual anchor. The daily rituals that had connected Kaimwaset to the divine realm ceased. Sacred Piteous, the crocodile incarnation of Sobek, slowly starved in his shrinking pool as no one remained who knew the proper procedures for caring for him. His death seemed to mark the final abandonment of the village by its protecting gods. Desperate rumors spread among the survivors. Some claimed the plague could be cured by drinking water, mixed with ground-up mummy wrappings stolen from ancient tombs. Others insisted that the disease was spread by looking directly at infected people, leading families to abandon their sick relatives in empty houses. A few whispered that the only safety lay in fleeing to the deep desert, far from all human contact. As autumn turned toward winter, the character of the village changed completely. Houses that had once echoed with children's laughter stood empty, their doors hanging open in the wind. Gardens that had provided vegetables for family meals were overrun with weeds and scavenging birds. The irrigation channels that had been the community's lifeline filled with debris and dead animals. The few dozen survivors faced an impossible choice: remain in their ancestral home and likely die of plague or starvation, or abandon everything their families had built over 8 generations and seek survival elsewhere. The decision would ultimately be made for them by forces beyond their control. As winter approached, tell me in the comments what you think you would have done in their situation. Would you have stayed to fight for your home or fled to seek safety elsewhere? Among the survivors, a disturbing pattern began emerging that defied the villagers' understanding of divine justice. The plague seemed to strike not randomly, but with a cruel precision that targeted those who had been most generous in sharing their dwindling food supplies. Nebet, the headman's wife, noticed it first when she realized that every family that had opened their doors to hungry neighbors was now mourning multiple deaths. Baitit, the elderly woman who had distributed her own grain to families with young children, was among the first to develop the fatal swellings. Kenti, a farmer who had shared his seed grain with less fortunate neighbors, died along with his entire household within a single week. Meanwhile, some of the most selfish villagers, those who had hoarded their resources and turned away starving neighbors, remained mysteriously healthy. Perhaps the gods favor those who protect their own families first, suggested Amenhotep, one of the few remaining wealthy farmers. He had survived by sealing his compound and refusing entry to anyone outside his immediate family. His granaries were still partially filled because he had shared nothing, and his household had avoided contact with infected neighbors. Maybe this plague is punishment for those who defied natural order by giving away what should have been kept for their own blood. This interpretation divided the remaining survivors into 2 desperate factions. One group, led by Amenhotep, argued that the plague was indeed divine punishment for excessive generosity. They pointed out that wealthy families who had maintained strict isolation were more likely to survive, while those who had shared their resources freely were dying in greater numbers. This group advocated for complete separation. Each remaining household should seal itself off and trust only in its own resources. The opposing faction, centered around the family of Hekenu the scribe, insisted that abandoning communal cooperation would doom everyone. Hekenu could read the ancient texts stored in the temple, and he argued that similar disasters in the past had been overcome only through collective action. Our ancestors survived the Great Famine during the reign of Djoser by working together, he declared. Individual families cannot dig new wells or repair the irrigation channels. We survive together or we all die alone. The debate became academic when the plague reached Amenhotep's supposedly secure compound. His teenage son developed symptoms overnight, despite having no contact with other villagers for weeks. Within 3 days, the boy was dead, and Amenhotep's faith in isolation as protection crumbled along with his son's fevered body. The disease had found its way past his barriers through means he could not understand or control. Hekenu, meanwhile, made a discovery that would have explained everything if anyone had possessed the knowledge to interpret it correctly. While searching through abandoned houses for any remaining food supplies, he noticed that the families suffering the worst death tolls were invariably those whose grain storage areas showed the heaviest signs of rat infestation. The connection between rodent contamination and human disease was beyond the medical understanding of the time, but Hekenu recognized a pattern. The rats carry some form of evil spirit, he theorized to his wife Hathor. They defile the grain, and anyone who eats the defiled food becomes possessed by the same malevolent force. It was primitive medical reasoning, but it led Hekenu to a practical solution. His family would eat only food that showed no signs of rodent contamination, and they would store their remaining supplies in sealed pottery jars suspended from roof beams where rats could not reach them. This precaution kept Hekenu's household relatively healthy while their neighbors continued dying, but it also made them targets of desperate suspicion. Other survivors began wondering why the scribe's family seemed immune to the plague that was decimating the community. Whispers spread that Hekenu possessed magical knowledge from the temple scrolls, perhaps even that he had caused the plague through sorcery in order to eliminate his rivals and seize control of the village's remaining resources. The suspicion intensified when Hekenu's wife Hathor began showing early signs of pregnancy. In a community where half the children had already died, the prospect of new life seemed almost supernatural. Some survivors interpreted it as a sign that the gods favored Hekenu's family, while others saw it as evidence of dark magic. How could a woman conceive during such a time of death unless she had made bargains with malevolent spirits? The tension reached a breaking point when Amenhotep, driven mad by grief over his son's death, accused Hekenu of deliberately spreading the plague through cursed grain. "He reads the forbidden texts in the temple," Amenhotep shouted to anyone who would listen. "He knows which formulas bring disease and which bring protection. Why else would his family remain healthy while children die all around us?" The accusation might have led to violence, but the community lacked the strength for internal conflict. Of the 3,000 souls who had called Kayamwaset home 6 months earlier, fewer than 80 remained alive. Most were weakened by hunger and disease, barely able to tend their own basic needs, much less organize any kind of coordinated action against suspected sorcerers. Instead of confrontation, the survivors simply avoided each other. Families that had once shared meals and celebrations now scurried between their houses like frightened animals, emerging only when absolutely necessary to search for food or tend to urgent needs. The village that had once thrived on communal cooperation became a collection of isolated individuals, each struggling alone against forces they could not understand or control. In this atmosphere of mutual distrust and supernatural fear, the final act of Kayamwaset's tragedy began to unfold. The survivors who had managed to avoid both starvation and plague would soon face a choice that would determine not just their own fate, but whether any memory of their community would survive for future generations to discover. As the season that should have brought the Nile's flood drew to a close, without any sign of rising water, the surviving villagers of Kayamwaset faced a reality more terrifying than death itself. They were going to have to abandon their ancestral home forever. The few families that remained were consuming their final reserves of grain, and there would be no harvest to replenish their stores. Even if the plague ended immediately, starvation would claim everyone who stayed. Hekenu the scribe attempted to organize an orderly evacuation. His literacy gave him authority among the survivors, and he argued that they should travel together to Memphis, where Pharaoh's administrators might provide refugee assistance. "We take what we can carry," he proposed, "and we go as a community to seek the mercy of the royal granaries. Perhaps when the flood returns next year, some of us can come back to rebuild." But the prospect of abandoning Kayamwaset triggered passionate resistance from unexpected sources. Ptah-hotep, an elderly farmer whose family had worked the same plots for 5 generations, declared he would rather die in his fields than live as a beggar in Memphis. "My father's bones are buried in this soil," he said, standing ankle-deep in his desiccated barley field. "My children played where these irrigation ditches run. If I leave this place, I am nothing, just another starving peasant with no name and no home." His sentiment resonated with other villagers who viewed departure as a form of spiritual death. In their understanding, the land itself was sacred, blessed by generations of ancestors, whose spirits still protected their descendants. To abandon Kayamwaset would be to cut themselves off from these ancestral guardians, leaving them vulnerable to even worse disasters in unfamiliar territory. The internal debate was complicated by practical concerns that made any evacuation extremely dangerous. The surviving villagers were mostly women, children, and elderly men, groups that would be vulnerable to bandits and slave traders on the roads to Memphis. Recent refugees from other failing Delta communities had brought reports of organized gangs that captured displaced families and sold them in the markets of Lower Egypt. Moreover, the approaching winter season made travel particularly hazardous. The same lack of flood that had destroyed Kayamwaset's agriculture had also disrupted transportation throughout the Delta. Many of the waterways that normally carried trade boats were too shallow for navigation, forcing travelers to walk across miles of sun-baked mud where temperatures during the day could kill the unprepared, and cold nights brought dangers of their own. Ankh-Efen Sekhmet, a widow whose husband had been among the plague's early victims, raised another crucial concern. What happens to our dead if we leave them here unprotected? Egyptian religious beliefs required that graves be maintained and offerings made regularly to sustain the deceased in their afterlife journey. Abandoning the village meant abandoning their buried loved ones to spiritual starvation, a fate considered worse than physical death. The debate took on supernatural dimensions when several survivors reported disturbing dreams that seemed to carry messages from the deceased. Kaimwaset had died clutching a handful of seeds he had been trying to plant in the dry earth, appeared to his brother in a vision and begged him not to leave the village unguarded. Aitet, the generous woman who had shared her grain with hungry children, was seen by multiple witnesses walking through the abandoned market area, seemingly searching for something she had lost. These dream visitations convinced many survivors that their dead relatives were actively opposing any evacuation plans. Perhaps the spirits of Kaimwaset were binding the living to the land through supernatural means, ensuring that someone would remain to tend their graves and preserve the memory of the community. Leaving might not just be abandonment, it might be impossible. The situation became even more complex when Hathor, Hekinu's pregnant wife, began experiencing complications that seemed related to the village's supernatural atmosphere. She complained of constant nightmares in which the voices of dead children called out for their mothers, begging not to be left alone in the empty houses where they had died. During the day, she claimed to see shadowy figures moving through the abandoned compounds, and she insisted she could hear the sound of pottery wheels spinning in workshops that had been silent for months. Her psychological distress manifested in physical symptoms that threatened both her life and that of her unborn child. She refused to eat, claiming that the spirits of the dead were stealing the food before it could nourish her body. She would not sleep in any of the abandoned houses, insisting that they were filled with malevolent presences that wanted to prevent new life from entering the world. Hekinu found himself trapped between his rational understanding that evacuation was necessary for survival and his desperate need to protect his wife and coming child. If they attempted to travel to Memphis in her current condition, both Hathor and the baby would likely die on the journey. But staying in Kaimwaset meant facing certain starvation within a matter of weeks. The final crisis came when Amenhotep, the wealthy farmer whose isolation had failed to protect his family, made a discovery that changed everything. While searching through the abandoned temple for anything of value that could be traded for food, he found Kaimwaset's private records hidden beneath the altar of Sobek. The dead priest had documented not just the village's religious ceremonies, but also detailed observations about the failed flood and its aftermath. According to these papyrus scrolls, Kaimwaset had been in communication with priests from other delta communities throughout the disaster. The failed inundation was not limited to their region. It extended from the First Cataract to the Mediterranean Sea. Memphis itself was suffering from grain shortages, and Pharaoh's administrators had issued orders that no new refugees would be accepted into the capital until the next successful flood restored agricultural productivity. In other words, there was nowhere to run. The disaster that had destroyed Kaimwaset had also eliminated all the potential refuges where the survivors might have found safety. They were trapped in a dead village, surrounded by a dying region with no possibility of rescue from the outside world. As this terrible truth settled over the remaining villagers, the final act of their tragedy began to unfold. The discovery of Kaimwaset's hidden records shattered the last hope that had kept the survivors of Kaimwaset clinging to life. Amenhotep read aloud from the papyrus scrolls in a voice cracked by thirst and desperation, translating the priest's careful hieroglyphic notations for the illiterate villagers gathered around him in the abandoned temple. "The flood has failed from Elephantine to the Delta mouth," he announced, his words echoing in the empty chamber where sacred Pitis's mummified form now lay shrouded in linen. 7 major settlements in our nome alone have been abandoned. The priests of Ptah in Memphis report that the royal granaries are under guard, and no grain will be distributed to refugees until the next inundation restores normal harvests. But there was more devastating news hidden in the priest's careful records. Kaimwaset had documented communications with temple officials throughout Lower Egypt, and their reports painted a picture of complete systemic collapse. The great city of Buto had lost half its population to starvation and disease. The fortress town of Zois had been abandoned by its garrison when soldiers deserted to search for food for their families. Even the sacred city of Sais, home to the goddess Neith, had closed its temples and dispersed its priests when the temple granaries ran empty. The worst revelation came in a letter from a priest in Tanis, written just weeks before communication between settlements had ceased entirely. He reported that bands of desperate refugees were attacking trade caravans and even raiding other villages for grain. Some groups had organized themselves into primitive armies, led by former soldiers who promised their followers that survival justified any action against weaker communities. The roads between settlements had become too dangerous for normal travel, cutting off the last possibility of coordinated relief efforts. A terrible silence followed these revelations. The 73 survivors, all that remained of Khemwaset's 3,000 souls, understood that they were witnessing not just the end of their community, but the collapse of their entire world. The great civilization of the Nile, which had seemed as permanent as the river itself, was crumbling under the weight of ecological disaster. Hekinu clutched his wife Hathor's trembling hand as she pressed her other palm against her swollen belly. Their unborn child, conceived in the early days of the disaster when hope still existed, now represented both the ultimate tragedy and the final possibility for redemption. If they could somehow survive long enough for the baby to be born, perhaps the new life could carry forward some memory of what Khemwaset had been. "We have grain for perhaps 10 more days if we reduce rations to survival minimums," calculated Nebet, the former headman's wife who had emerged as the community's practical leader after her husband's death from plague. "After that, we face a choice between starvation and—" She could not bring herself to speak aloud the unspeakable options that desperation might force upon them. The unspoken alternatives hung in the air like the smell of death that pervaded the village. Some communities facing similar disasters had reportedly turned to cannibalism, consuming first the bodies of plague victims, then the flesh of the weakest survivors. Other groups had practiced exposure, abandoning the elderly and sick to die alone so that their food could extend the lives of those with better chances of survival. Still others had resorted to infanticide, reasoning that children too young to work consumed resources that could keep adults alive through the crisis. Tahotep, the elderly farmer who had refused to consider evacuation, spoke into the terrible silence with a voice that carried the authority of his years. "There is another way," he said slowly, "though it requires courage that I am not certain we possess." He gestured toward the temple's inner sanctuary, where offerings to Sobek had once been stored. "Our ancestors faced disasters before this one. They survived by making sacrifices that ensured the continuity of their bloodline through the worst times." His meaning became clear as he continued speaking. "Some of us must die so that others can live long enough to see the flood return. Not through murder or abandonment, but through voluntary sacrifice. The old and sick should cease eating, giving their rations to the young and strong. Those already infected with plague should isolate themselves completely, preventing further spread of disease. We save whom we can save, rather than letting everyone die equally." The proposal horrified the survivors, but its brutal logic was undeniable. Mathematical calculation showed that if half the remaining villagers stopped consuming food immediately, the other half might survive long enough to see the next inundation, assuming it came within a normal time frame. The sacrifice of 36 lives could potentially preserve 37, including Hathor's unborn child. But even this desperate mathematics rested on assumptions that might prove false. What if the flood failed again next year? What if the survivors were too weakened by prolonged starvation to rebuild their community? What if the ecological collapse that had destroyed the Delta was permanent rather than temporary? The choice between certain death for all and probable death for most offered no genuine solution, only different forms of despair. Ankh-Efen Sekhmet, the widow whose husband had died early in the plague, was the first to volunteer for the death group. "I have no children to carry forward my name," she declared, "and my husband's spirit calls to me from the afterlife. I choose to join him now rather than prolong suffering that serves no purpose." Her decision triggered an emotional avalanche as others began following her lead. Elderly villagers who felt they had lived their full span, individuals showing early symptoms of plague who feared infecting others, and some who simply lacked the will to continue fighting. Among those who volunteered was Senebkai, a craftsman whose arthritis had made him unable to contribute meaningful labor to the community's survival efforts. "My hands can no longer shape clay or repair tools," he said, holding up fingers twisted by years of repetitive work. "I consume food that could strengthen the hands of younger workers. My death serves life better than my continued existence." But the plan revealed unexpected complexities that its proposers had not anticipated. Who would decide which survivors were young and strong enough to merit continued feeding? What happened if someone volunteered for death but then changed their mind when starvation began? How could the community ensure that the sacrifice group actually died quickly, rather than lingering in agony that would demoralize the survivors? These questions became academic when Hathor went into premature labor, triggered by the stress of witnessing the community's final dissolution. Her screams of pain echoed through the empty village as Hekenu and the other women tried desperately to assist with a birth that was occurring weeks too early. Without proper medical supplies, experienced midwives, or even adequate nutrition for the mother, the delivery became a nightmare of blood and agony. The women attending Hathor had only primitive knowledge of childbirth complications. They tried to ease her pain with warm compresses made from precious boiled water, but they lacked the herbs and medicines that might have helped. Meresank, an elderly woman who had assisted with births in better times, wept as she realized that all her experience was useless without the proper tools and supplies. The baby, a daughter they named Meritneith after a queen from ancient times, lived only long enough to draw a few shallow breaths before her tiny body succumbed to the hostile environment into which she had been born. She was perfectly formed, but too small and weak to survive outside the womb. Hekenu held her for a few precious moments, feeling her heartbeat grow fainter until it stopped entirely. Hathor followed her daughter into death within hours, her body too weakened by starvation and psychological trauma to survive the complications of difficult labor. The hemorrhaging that began during delivery could not be stopped with the limited medical knowledge available to the survivors. She died calling out her daughter's name, believing she could see the infant spirit waiting for her in the afterlife. As Hekenu knelt in the dust, cradling the bodies of his wife and daughter, the remaining survivors understood that their final hope had died with them. The child who might have carried forward the memory of Khemwaset would never grow up to tell their story. The bloodline that connected them to 8 generations of ancestors was ending in failure and despair. The psychological impact of watching their last baby die destroyed what remained of the community's will to survive. The elaborate plans for organized sacrifice became irrelevant, as the survivors simply began dying naturally, their bodies too weakened by months of starvation to fight off even minor infections. The elderly succumbed first, their ancient frames finally surrendering to exhaustion that no amount of determination could overcome. Children followed next, their small bodies consuming their reserves more quickly than adults. Their deaths were perhaps the most heartbreaking, as parents watched their offspring fade away despite receiving larger food rations than anyone else. The surviving adults had to witness their genetic legacy disappearing before their eyes, knowing that their family lines would end with them. Finally, the adults in their prime years who had somehow managed to cling to life through the worst of the disaster began succumbing to the cumulative effects of prolonged malnutrition. Their bodies had cannibalized muscle tissue to keep vital organs functioning. But eventually, even this desperate measure failed. They died not from disease or violence, but simply from the impossibility of maintaining human life without adequate resources. Amenhotep, the wealthy farmer whose initial selfishness had preserved his family, found himself among the last survivors not because of any superior virtue, but simply because his hoarded grain had allowed him to maintain his strength longer than his neighbors. But strength without hope is merely a prolonged form of dying, and he spent his final days wandering through the abandoned compounds like a ghost, haunting his own memories. In his delirium, Amenhotep began talking to the ghosts of his dead neighbors, apologizing for his selfishness and begging their forgiveness. He distributed his remaining grain to families that no longer existed, leaving portions at empty houses where entire households had died months earlier. His final act was to write a confession on a pottery shard, admitting his role in the community's destruction and asking the gods to judge him mercifully. The last entry in Khemwaset's records, written in Hekenu's careful hand before fever claimed his life, consisted of a single sentence: "May the gods grant that someone, someday, will remember that we tried to live with dignity even as our world ended." He died with the writing brush still in his hand, having spent his final conscious moments ensuring that their story would survive, even if they could not. When the Nile's flood finally returned the following summer, it found Khemwaset transformed into a tomb. The mud brick houses still stood intact, their walls dried and cracked but structurally sound. Pottery vessels sat precisely where their owners had left them, filled now with dust instead of grain. Children's toys lay scattered in courtyards where weeds had begun growing through the packed earth floors. The returning floodwaters lapped at the edges of the abandoned village, but the irrigation channels that had once distributed life-giving water throughout the community remained clogged with debris and silt. Without human hands to maintain them, the sophisticated hydraulic system that had sustained agriculture for centuries had become useless. The flood that might have saved Kaimwaset arrived too late to resurrect the community that had died waiting for it. The bodies of the final survivors had been naturally preserved by the dry climate, becoming mummified where they fell. Amenhotep was discovered in his storage room, clutching an empty grain jar, his face bearing an expression of infinite sadness rather than the anger that had characterized his final months. Hekenu lay beside his wife and infant daughter, their forms arranged as if he had tried to embrace them one final time before succumbing to his own exhaustion. Ptahhotep was found in his barley field, his desiccated fingers still grasping seeds he had been attempting to plant in the hardened soil. Even in death, his body spoke of a man who had refused to abandon hope until his final breath. Beside him lay the primitive farming tools his family had used for generations, now destined to rust away with no hands to wield them. The natural mummification had preserved not just bodies, but also the personal possessions that told the story of each individual's final days. Women were found clutching jewelry they had hoped to trade for food. Men died holding weapons they had planned to use for hunting if any game could be found. Children's mummified hands still grasped the simple toys that had provided comfort during their final suffering. The first boats to explore the abandoned village were traders from Memphis, drawn by reports that a prosperous Delta community had mysteriously fallen silent. What they found defied their understanding of how disasters typically unfolded. Usually, communities died gradually. People fled, settlements shrank, and eventually only the most stubborn residents remained. But Kaimwaset had simply stopped existing all at once, as if its entire population had agreed to vanish simultaneously. The traders were experienced men who had seen the aftermath of wars, famines, and plagues in their travels throughout Egypt. But the complete preservation of an entire dead community unsettled them in ways that battlefield carnage never had. The village looked as if its inhabitants had simply stepped outside for a moment and would return at any time to resume their interrupted lives. Initially, the traders approached cautiously, fearing that plague might still linger in the abandoned houses. But when no signs of active disease appeared after several days of careful exploration, they began the grim work of salvaging whatever valuable items remained. They loaded their boats with anything that could be sold in Memphis: copper tools, jewelry, pottery, linen cloth, and furniture. They also discovered treasures that the original inhabitants would have considered priceless: the papyrus records that Kaimwaset and Hekenu had maintained throughout the disaster. These documents represented one of the most complete accounts of societal collapse ever recorded, but to the traders, they were simply exotic writing materials that educated buyers in Memphis might purchase for their rarity. The psychological impact of exploring Kaimwaset proved too much for some of the traders. Several men refused to enter houses where mummified families sat around tables as if waiting for meals that would never come. Others reported nightmares in which the dead villagers pleaded with them to stay and rebuild the community. The expedition leader eventually decided to complete their salvage work as quickly as possible and leave the cursed place behind. Word of Kaimwaset's fate spread throughout the surviving communities of the Delta, taking on mythical proportions that transformed the historical disaster into a cautionary tale about divine punishment and human hubris. Some storytellers claimed the village had been destroyed because its inhabitants had grown too proud and forgotten to honor the gods properly. Others insisted it had been cursed by jealous neighbors who had coveted its prosperity. Archaeological evidence suggests that Kaimwaset was never resettled. The location proved too psychologically powerful for new inhabitants. Later generations of Egyptians viewed it as a cursed place where the gods had withdrawn their protection. The very completeness of its preservation made it more terrifying than ruins that showed evidence of gradual decline or violent destruction. The irrigation channels silted up and were never repaired. The fields returned to marsh, then to desert as changing weather patterns shifted the Nile's course away from the area. Within a generation, even the location of Kaimwaset became uncertain as landmarks disappeared, and older residents who remembered the village died without passing on their knowledge. The papyrus records found their way into the royal archives at Memphis, where they remained stored and forgotten for thousands of years. Occasionally, a scholar would discover them while researching other topics, but the detailed account of community collapse made uncomfortable reading for officials whose job was to maintain social stability. The records were quietly filed away rather than studied or copied. Modern archaeologists who excavated the site in the 1960s found evidence that corroborated the ancient records. Skeletal remains showed clear signs of malnutrition and disease. Rat bones were discovered in unusually high concentrations around grain storage areas. Most tellingly, the excavation revealed no evidence of violence or external attack. The village had died from within, consumed by forces its inhabitants could neither understand nor control. Carbon dating of organic materials confirmed that the entire community had died within a single season, supporting the ancient accounts of rapid collapse. The preservation of personal possessions in their original locations suggested that the final inhabitants had maintained hope for survival until the very end, since they had not attempted to convert their belongings into portable wealth for flight to other regions. The tragedy of Khaemwaset represents more than just a local disaster. It illustrates how quickly the foundations of civilization can crumble when natural systems fail. The Nile's flood was not just an agricultural necessity, it was the beating heart of Egyptian society, the divine promise that connected pharaohs to gods and peasants to prosperity. When that promise was broken, even temporarily, the entire social order revealed its fundamental fragility. Perhaps most haunting is the realization that the villagers' final choice, to remain in their ancestral home rather than flee to uncertain refuge elsewhere, may have been the only dignified option available to them. The outside world they might have escaped to was collapsing just as completely as their own community. By staying in Khaemwaset, they preserved not just their own deaths, but the memory of how they had lived. The papyrus records left by Khaemhaset and Hekenu provide one of the most detailed accounts of societal collapse from the ancient world. Their careful documentation shows how drought, famine, disease, and social breakdown reinforced each other in a cascade of disaster that no individual community could have prevented or survived. Yet their persistence in recording events, even as their world ended, demonstrates a faith that someone somehow would eventually bear witness to their experience. That faith was justified. The story of Khaemwaset, preserved in hieroglyphic script and archaeological evidence, serves as a testament to both human vulnerability and human resilience. The villagers who died there were not heroes or villains. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with whatever courage and wisdom they could summon. Their story reminds us that civilization, no matter how ancient or powerful, exists at the mercy of forces beyond human control. The Nile would flood again, Egypt would rebuild and prosper for thousands of years more, but Khaemwaset would remain forever empty, a silent monument to the season when the river forgot to rise and an entire community chose dignity over desperation in their final hours. What lessons can we draw from this ancient tragedy about how communities respond to existential threats? And what does it tell us about the delicate balance between human ambition and natural forces that sustains all civilizations? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the ancient world that continue to speak to us across the millennia.